One of the most unsettling cases that Dr. Elizabeth Kübler Ross documented in her research archives on near-death experiences occurred in 1968 when she was invited to conduct clinical interviews in a small Bavarian town in Germany, not far from the ruins of the former Flossenbürg concentration camp. The patient was a 43-year-old man, born and raised in that region, who had survived a massive stroke that had left him in a deep coma for 4 months and 17 days. The medical circumstances were serious enough that the local hospital neurologists considered his recovery almost impossible. A cerebral angiography showed extensive damage in the left hemisphere, with areas of tissue necrosis that, according to the medical records, should have resulted in severe and permanent cognitive sequelae. Electroencephalograms performed during the coma indicated severely compromised brain activity. When the patient finally regained consciousness in March of that year, his first statement was so baffling that the medical team initially interpreted it as post-traumatic confusion or severe aphasia. He insisted, with a disturbing clarity that contrasted with his compromised neurological state, that he wasn't who everyone thought he was. Dr. Kübler Ross was called in precisely because the case presented features that defied conventional psychiatric protocols. The man did not display the typical symptoms of dissociative amnesia or identity disorder. He recognized his family, his German civilian name, his home, and his profession as a carpenter. But parallel to this identity, he carried vivid, detailed memories of a completely different life. Memories he described as more real and heavier than his current existence. What made the case even more perplexing was a seemingly impossible temporal paradox, an element that Dr. Kübler Ross recorded as central to understanding the extraordinary nature of the phenomenon. The memories the patient carried were of events that occurred after his own birth, suggesting some form of continuity of consciousness operating outside the conventional boundaries of temporal causality. During the first clinical interview sessions, conducted in his hospital room where he was still recovering, the patient told the doctor that during the months of the coma, he hadn't experienced darkness or emptiness. On the contrary, he described a state of continuous and intensely lucid consciousness where he gradually began to remember another existence, another name, and another language that he didn't know in his current life, but that now flowed through his mind with unquestionable naturalness. He remembered being a high-ranking military officer, a major general in the Soviet Red Army, whose name he pronounced with difficulty in German, but which sounded like Pyotr Georgievich Novikov. The memories didn't come as scattered fragments or dreamlike images, but as a coherent and chronological narrative of an entire military life, from training at the Frunze Military Academy in Moscow to the terrifying final days in a prisoner of war camp in the very region where he now lived. The richness of the details was extraordinary and deeply disturbing. He described with meticulous accuracy the hierarchical structure of the Red Army in the 1940s, the uniforms of different military corps, the battle tactics employed on the eastern fronts, and the names of commanders and military divisions that a Bavarian carpenter would have no reason to know. Even more impressive was his ability to describe specific geographies of the Eastern Front, destroyed villages in Ukraine and Belarus, and retreat routes through forests and swamps, with a level of specificity that seemed impossible to be the product of imagination or casually acquired knowledge. But the most baffling core of his account lay in the final memories of this other life. He described his capture by German forces in June 1943, during an unsuccessful military operation near the Polish border. As a high-ranking prisoner of war, he was transferred through several detention camps until he arrived in April 1944 at the Flossenbürg concentration camp, located just 20 miles from the small town where he now lived his life as a German carpenter. His descriptions of the camp were so detailed and anatomically precise that Dr. Kübler Ross felt the need to verify them. He described the exact arrangement of the barracks, the location of the watchtowers, the granite quarry where prisoners were forced to work until physical collapse, and the small brick building where summary executions were carried out. He remembered the guards, their faces, and their specific, personalized cruelties. He remembered the penetrating cold of the Bavarian winter of 1944, the hunger that eroded not just the body, but the very ability to form coherent thoughts, and the silent despair that set in when the prisoners understood that there would be no liberation, only different forms of death. Dr. Kübler Ross, in her clinical notes from that period, recorded her own perplexity regarding the phenomenon. She was, first and foremost, a scientist trained in the rigor of the empirical method, and her first inclination was to seek conventional neurological explanations. The stroke could have caused severe alterations in memory circuits and personal identity. The lesion in the left hemisphere, particularly in the temporal and limbic areas, could result in elaborate confabulations, where the damaged brain fills memory gaps with fabricated narratives that the patient experiences as genuinely real. The medical literature documented cases of patients who, after brain trauma, developed detailed false memories of events that never occurred, memories that were phenomenologically indistinguishable from true memories for the patient himself. Dr. Kübler Ross also considered the possibility that the patient had been exposed, at some point in his life, to historical accounts of World War II, the Red Army, and the Nazi concentration camps, and that this information, stored fragmentarily in his long-term memory, had been reorganized during the coma into a cohesive but fictitious narrative of an alternative identity. However, as the clinical interviews proceeded over the following weeks, verifiable elements began to emerge from the patient's accounts, elements that challenged conventional neurological explanations. During the fifth session, held in April 1968, the patient described with extraordinary detail his death at the Flossenburg camp. He reported that in August 1944, after 4 months of forced labor in the quarry and progressive physical deterioration, he contracted epidemic typhus, a disease that plagued the camp due to non-existent sanitary conditions. He described the symptoms of typhus fever with impressive medical accuracy for a carpenter with no health training. The high fever that reached 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the feverish delirium, the pink spots on the torso, the bloody diarrhea, and the progressive stupor. He remembered being dragged to the terminal ward, a place the prisoners simply called the House of the Dead, where those who could no longer work were left without food or medical care until death took them. There, he described spending his last conscious days in a state of unspeakable physical suffering, but also in a peculiar mental state that he described as a paradoxical expansion of consciousness, where the pain of the body seemed increasingly distant, while something inside him became increasingly awake and attentive. He reported to Dr. Kübler Ross that at the moment of physical death, which he placed around August 19, 1944, he did not experience darkness or cessation of consciousness. On the contrary, there was what he described as an abrupt but gentle transition, like crossing an invisible membrane between two states of existence. He suddenly found himself outside his disease-ravaged body, observing from an elevated point near the ceiling of the barracks that emaciated, feverish form lying on the filthy straw. The first sensation was one of immense relief, a relief so profound that he described it as the end of a torture that had lasted not just the months in the camp, but his entire physical existence. He could see the other dying prisoners around him. He could hear their moans and agonizing breaths, but he no longer felt any emotional connection to that suffering. There was a complete separation between his observing consciousness and that world of pain. Then, gradually, he realized he was no longer in the barracks. His consciousness had been transported without perceptible physical movement to a space he described as vast and undefined, without clear geometric characteristics, a space that was simultaneously internal and external, where conventional notions of physical location made no sense. In this space, he began to experience what he described as a complete review of his life as Pyotr Georgievich Novikov. It wasn't like watching a film or sequentially recalling memories. It was as if his entire existence was simultaneously present, as if he could perceive at once every moment of his military life, every decision he had made, and every action he had committed. But what made this review profoundly terrifying was that he didn't just experience it from his own perspective. He felt, with an unbearable visceral intensity, the consequences of his actions on all other people involved. Every order he had given as a military officer, every tactical decision that had resulted in the deaths of soldiers under his command, every moment of cruelty or indifference to human suffering during the war years, all of this he now experienced not just as a recollection, but as a direct experience of the pains he had caused. He felt the terror of the young soldiers he had sent on suicidal missions. He felt the grief of the families who received news of death, and he felt the despair of the prisoners of war he had personally interrogated with brutal methods during military campaigns. There was no external judgment, no accusatory voice, no entity condemning him. The judgment was intrinsic to the very structure of the experience. It was the unalterable weight of having consciously caused suffering in the world. Dr. Kübler Ross recorded in her notes that the patient cried convulsively while describing this phase of the experience. He insisted that there were no words capable of conveying the magnitude of that moral suffering. In that state of expanded consciousness, he understood that to cause suffering to another human being was to cause suffering to oneself, because at the deepest level, there is no real separation between consciousnesses. This understanding came as a direct perception of the structure of existence. After what seemed like an eternity, his consciousness began to dissolve, as if the identity of Pyotr Novikov were fragmenting until nothing recognizable as a coherent self remained. What followed was a period of absolute emptiness, without time or perception. Then, gradually, a new form of consciousness emerged, without memories or identity, just pure perception taking shape. He began to perceive physical sensations of a different body, smaller, more fragile. Voices spoke in German, a language he gradually began to recognize. He was being born again into the body of a baby in 1925, in the same region of Bavaria, where, in another existence, he would die 19 years later as a Soviet prisoner of war. Throughout the childhood and youth of this new life, the memories of Pyotr Novikov remained completely inaccessible, buried in some deep layer of his consciousness. He grew up as an ordinary German child, learned the carpentry trade from his father, survived the difficult years of the war and post-war period, married, had children, and lived an ordinary and uneventful existence. It was only when the stroke plunged him into that 4-month deep coma that the memories of the previous life began to resurface. He described the coma period not as unconsciousness, but as a state of altered consciousness where the barriers between the two existences began to dissolve. In the silent, suspended space of the coma, where his body was motionless but his mind somehow remained active, he began to remember Moscow, the military campaigns, the concentration camp, and the death by typhus. When he finally woke up from the coma, he carried 2 complete lives in a single consciousness, 2 identities coexisting in a paradoxical and profoundly disturbing way. In documenting this case, Dr. Kübler Ross faced a significant methodological dilemma. As a scientist, she couldn't simply accept the patient's account as evidence of reincarnation or the continuity of consciousness after death. Conventional neurological explanations remained plausible and parsimonious hypotheses. However, she committed to investigating the verifiable elements of the account, an approach she had adopted in other near-death experience cases where patients reported information they supposedly couldn't know. She requested permission from the patient to access historical records of the Flossenbürg concentration camp, documents that had been partially preserved after the camp's liberation by Allied forces in April 1945. She also contacted military historians specializing in the Red Army and Soviet archives that maintained records of officers captured during the war. The verification process took months and involved correspondence with multiple institutions in different countries, a meticulous investigation that she conducted parallel to continuous clinical interviews with the patient. The results of this investigation were deeply unsettling. Historical records confirmed the existence of a Soviet major general named Pyotr Georgievich Novikov, whose military career broadly corresponded to what the patient had described. Novikov had indeed served on various fronts during the war, had been captured in June 1943, and had been transferred to the Flossenburg camp in April 1944. The camp records, although incomplete due to the systematic destruction of documents by the Nazis in the final days of the war, contained an entry dated August 21, 1944, registering the death of a prisoner identified as a high-ranking Soviet officer with the cause of death listed as epidemic typhus. The date corresponded, with a 2-day margin, to the date the patient had provided for Novikov's death. Even more disturbing was the fact that the patient had described specific details of the camp's physical structure, including minor architectural modifications made in 1944, details that did not appear in photographs or published accounts of Flossenburg, but which were confirmed by surviving former prisoners whom Dr. Kübler Ross located and interviewed as part of her investigation. However, aspects of the account remained impossible to verify objectively. The patient described personal interactions with specific other prisoners, conversations held in the barracks, and intimate details of subjective experiences that left no trace in official documents. He had mentioned the name of a Schutzstaffel, SS guard, who supposedly supervised the quarry and was known among the prisoners for his particular cruelty. Dr. Kübler Ross was able to confirm, through testimonies from war crimes trials held after 1945, that a guard with that name had indeed served at Flossenburg during the relevant period and had been convicted of atrocities committed against prisoners. But this, she acknowledged in her notes, did not constitute definitive proof that the patient had actually been Novikov. It was possible, though unlikely, that the patient had accessed this information through conventional channels during his life and had unconsciously incorporated it into his confabulatory narrative. What most intrigued Dr. Kübler Ross was not the verifiable historical details, however impressive, but rather the phenomenological structure of the death and rebirth experience the patient described. This qualitative dimension of the case deserved, in her view, investigation as rigorous as the verification of historical facts. She began to identify patterns in this account that echoed structures present in ancient traditions of knowledge about the journey of the soul after death. The phase of life review the patient described, where he experienced the consequences of his actions on other beings, corresponded to descriptions found in texts she had studied on post-mortem judgment processes, where the soul is confronted not by an external judge, but by the accumulated weight of its own choices and actions. In these ancient traditions, there is the understanding that every human action generates consequences that reverberate through invisible layers of reality, and that after death, the soul must confront these reverberations directly, experiencing the full impact of everything it did during its physical life. What is described is not a system of arbitrary punishment imposed by an external authority, but a natural process of understanding and integration, where the soul clearly sees the truth of its own existence without the distortions and rationalizations that were possible during life in the body. The patient's description of the period of identity dissolution, where Novikov's consciousness fragmented until it completely ceased, also echoed descriptions of intermediate states between existences, states where the personal identity constructed during a specific life must be dissolved so that a new formation can emerge. In these traditions, there is the understanding that what we call the self or personal identity is a temporary construct, a specific configuration of consciousness that serves specific purposes during a particular incarnation, but which does not represent the totality of the being. After death, this construct must be dismantled, and the essential elements that composed it must undergo a process of purification before they can be reorganized into a new configuration. The period the patient described as absolute emptiness could correspond to this state of complete dissolution, where there is no longer any residue of the previous identity, just a pure potentiality awaiting new manifestation. The process of rebirth he described, where a new consciousness gradually awakened in the body of a baby, while the memories of the previous life remained completely inaccessible until a specific trauma released them, also corresponded to patterns described in ancient traditions. In these descriptions, there is the understanding that the veil of forgetfulness that covers previous lives is not a defect or failure of the system, but a necessary feature that allows each new life to be lived with genuine freshness and possibility of choice. If a being were born with complete remembrance of all its previous existences, carrying the accumulated weight of all actions, all relationships, all traumas, it would be impossible to fully live the new life. Forgetfulness is, from this perspective, a form of structural mercy embedded in the very fabric of reality, allowing each existence to be a real opportunity for renewal. However, these same traditions recognize that in specific circumstances, particularly when there is a need to resolve unresolved issues from previous existences, the memories can resurface, generally through dreams, altered states of consciousness, or crisis situations such as serious illnesses or near-death experiences. Dr. Kübler Ross observed in her notes that the fact that the patient was born in the same geographical region where Novikov died, only 20 miles from the Flossenburg camp, was an element that could not be easily dismissed as mere statistical coincidence. Even more unsettling was the temporal impossibility. The patient was born in 1925, 19 years before Novikov's death in 1944. This paradox, far from invalidating the case in the researcher's eyes, made it even more significant. The patient insisted that his experience during the coma suggested that time, as we experience it in ordinary, waking consciousness, was not a fundamental characteristic of the underlying reality. He described that in the state of expanded consciousness between Novikov's death and his rebirth as a German carpenter, there was no temporal linearity, no past or future in the conventional sense. Dr. Kübler Ross recorded this claim without endorsing it, but acknowledging that if there were indeed some unknown mechanism for the continuity of consciousness between lives, there was no reason to assume that this mechanism would obey the causal laws that govern physical matter. Dr. Kübler Ross remained deeply skeptical. As a physician trained in the materialist scientific paradigm, she was committed to the principle that extraordinary explanations require extraordinary evidence. She continued to consider explanations through neurological, psychological, and cultural factors. The stroke had caused damage to brain regions associated with memory and identity. During the prolonged coma, the brain could have generated elaborate hallucinatory experiences. The specific content of these experiences could have been influenced by prior exposure to local stories about Flossenburg, or by films or conversations heard during childhood about the horrors of the nearby camp. However, this explanation faced difficulties when confronted with the verifiable details of the case, particularly the knowledge of Russian and the precise historical data that the patient should not have possessed. Dr. Kübler Ross conducted extensive interviews with the patient's wife, his children, close friends, and co-workers, trying to establish whether at any point in his life he had demonstrated unusual interest in Soviet military history or Nazi concentration camps. All interviewees were consistent in describing the patient as a simple man, focused on his manual labor, with limited formal education and no particular interest in history or politics. His wife insisted that he had never visited the ruins of Flossenburg, never read books about the war, and never shown curiosity about the region's dark past. She described how, after waking from the coma, he had become a completely different person, tormented by memories that were not his own. Dr. Kübler Ross also observed significant behavioral changes in the patient that were difficult to attribute simply to confabulation or brain damage. He had developed a functional knowledge of the Russian language, particularly military and technical vocabulary, which he did not possess before the accident. To objectively verify this ability, the doctor conducted a series of controlled tests. First, she established a baseline through interviews with the family and school records, confirming that the patient had never studied Russian and had no documented exposure to the language. Then, she brought in a Russian-speaking linguist from the University of Munich, who was unaware of the case details to avoid expectation bias. The tests were performed in a controlled environment, without Dr. Kübler Ross's presence, and included tasks of oral comprehension, responses to complex questions in Russian, and identification of specific technical military terms from the 1940s. The patient demonstrated the ability to understand and respond appropriately, albeit with an imperfect accent and grammatical structure, particularly in vocabulary related to military tactics, command hierarchies, and operational procedures that were not widely documented in publicly accessible sources. Even more intriguing was his knowledge of specific Soviet military protocols from World War II. When confronted with historical maps of the Eastern fronts, he identified locations of specific battles, troop movement routes, and strategic positions with a level of specificity that surprised the military historians consulted by Dr. Kübler Ross. There was also the emotional and existential dimension of the patient's experience, a dimension that Dr. Kübler Ross considered as important as the verifiable details. He did not recount his Novikov memories with detachment or academic curiosity, but with a deep and genuine suffering that permeated every interview session. He described carrying the moral weight of actions committed by Novikov as if they were his own actions, as if he were personally responsible for the deaths Novikov had caused as a military officer. He wept when remembering orders that sent young soldiers to their deaths, when remembering prisoners of war who were brutally interrogated under his command, and when remembering tactical decisions that sacrificed human lives in the name of abstract military objectives. This suffering did not appear to be the product of imagination or fantasy, but carried the phenomenological texture of genuine remorse, of a visceral guilt impossible to fake or simulate. Dr. Kübler Ross, with her long clinical experience in distinguishing between authentic suffering and emotional performance, was convinced that the patient was experiencing something profoundly real for him, regardless of the objective nature of that reality. During the final interview sessions conducted in June 1968, before Dr. Kübler Ross returned to the United States, the patient began to articulate a deeper understanding of the meaning of his experience. He described that initially, in the first months after waking from the coma, he had been consumed by terror and confusion, unable to understand why he was being forced to remember a life that seemingly was not his, a life marked by violence and suffering that he, as a German carpenter, had never experienced. But gradually, through conversations with Dr. Kübler Ross and through his own solitary reflection, he began to realize that perhaps the purpose of carrying those memories was not to punish him, but to teach him something fundamental about the nature of human existence and the interconnectedness of all beings. He began to understand that if his experience had any reality, if there was indeed some form of continuity between Novikov's consciousness and his own consciousness, then this suggested that there is no absolute separation between human beings, that at the deepest level, we are all part of a single fabric of consciousness that manifests through multiple individual forms. He described that this understanding had completely transformed his relationship with other people and with life in general. He could no longer see any human being as fundamentally separate or different from himself. When he looked at his children, he saw not only their unique personalities and individual characteristics, but he also perceived the same essence of consciousness that he recognized in himself, the same spark that had survived Novikov's death and now animated his own body. When he met strangers on the streets of his small town, he perceived that each of them carried their own complex story of suffering and search, and that at some invisible but real level, he was connected to each of them through this web of shared consciousness. This perception was not comfortable or comforting. On the contrary, it brought an overwhelming sense of responsibility, because if all beings are fundamentally interconnected, then every action that harms another being is ultimately a form of self-destruction, and every action that alleviates the suffering of another is a form of self-healing. Dr. Kübler Ross noted in her final remarks on the case that she remained agnostic about the objective nature of the patient's experience. She was not prepared to state that he had truly been Novikov in a previous life, nor was she prepared to completely dismiss that possibility. What she could affirm with certainty was that the patient had undergone a profound transformation of consciousness that could not be adequately explained solely through conventional neurological models of brain damage and confabulation. There was a numinous quality to his experience, a sense of having touched something that transcended the ordinary categories of scientific explanation. She began to consider that perhaps the most important question was not whether the patient had really been Novikov, but rather what his experience revealed about the capacities of human consciousness. If the brain, under extreme conditions, was capable of generating such transformative experiences, it suggested that our scientific understanding of consciousness was inadequate. Here was a patient whose brain had suffered massive damage, and yet during the coma, he had experienced states he described as more lucid than ordinary consciousness. This contradiction suggested that perhaps consciousness was not simply produced by the brain, but that the brain functioned as an interface, limiting a broader consciousness. Dr. Kübler Ross also reflected on the broader pattern she had been observing in her years of research on near-death experiences. This Flossenberg case was not unique in presenting elements that challenged conventional explanations, but it stood out for the convergence of multiple verifiable factors, for the temporal paradox that made it impossible according to our understanding of causality, and for the depth of the patient's psychological transformation. However, she also recognized the dangers of allowing her own wishes to influence her interpretation of the data. The history of science was full of examples of researchers who had convinced themselves of extraordinary phenomena based on evidence that later turned out to be inadequate. For this reason, she maintained rigorous skepticism, sought alternative explanations, and preserved a healthy doubt even in the face of cases as impressive as that of the carpenter from Flossenberg. She was also aware that even if near-death experiences genuinely reflected some form of continuity of consciousness after death, this did not necessarily validate any specific religious or spiritual tradition. The accounts she documented were deeply influenced by the cultural context and the patient's prior beliefs, suggesting that even if there was some underlying objective phenomenon, it was filtered through the cultural and psychological lenses of each individual. In the years that followed the Flossenberg case, Dr. Kübler Ross continued to document and analyze near-death experiences, expanding her research to include cases from multiple cultures and geographical contexts. She maintained occasional correspondence with the Bavarian carpenter, monitoring his psychological adaptation to the integration of Novikov's memories into his present identity. He reported that as time passed, the memories did not disappear, but became less oppressive, less intrusive in his daily life. He had learned to live with two life stories coexisting in his consciousness, accepting that he might never fully comprehend the meaning or nature of that coexistence. He described finding a form of peace, not through definitive answers, but through the acceptance of the mystery. He had stopped trying to prove to himself or others that he had really been Novikov, and instead focused on living his present life as ethically and compassionately as possible, guided by the painful lessons Novikov's memories had taught him about the consequences of the suffering we inflict on other beings. Dr. Kübler Ross concluded her notes on this case with a reflection on the limits of scientific knowledge and the need for intellectual humility in the face of phenomena that challenge our usual categories of understanding. She wrote that science, despite all its extraordinary successes in uncovering the mechanisms of the natural world, still operates within certain fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. Assumptions that may be adequate for studying physical objects, but may be inadequate for studying consciousness and subjective experience. The insistence of scientific materialism that only what can be objectively measured has reality might be a methodological limitation that prevents us from investigating genuine dimensions of existence that operate through different principles than those governing physical matter. She was not advocating for the abandonment of the scientific method or the uncritical acceptance of extraordinary claims, but rather for an expansion of what we consider legitimate data for scientific investigation. The subjective experiences of patients, the phenomenological patterns in altered states of consciousness, the profound transformations of values and perception that follow certain types of experiences, all of this constituted real data that deserved to be taken seriously, even if it couldn't be easily fitted into the dominant materialistic paradigms. The case of the carpenter from Flossenburg remained, until the end of Dr. Kübler Ross's career, one of the most perplexing and significant in her archives. It represented, in concentrated form, all the central questions that her research on near-death experiences had raised over decades. The possibility of consciousness independent of the cerebral substrate, the question of continuity of identity across death, the significance of the correlations between patient accounts and descriptions in ancient traditions of knowledge, and the relationship between suffering, transformation, and moral understanding. She never reached definitive answers to these questions, and perhaps, she reflected, definitive answers were not possible within the limitations of human knowledge. But she considered that asking the right questions, investigating with rigor and honesty, and remaining open to possibilities that challenge our comfortable assumptions all constituted valuable scientific work, even in the absence of final conclusions. The mystery of consciousness and death remained intact, but through cases like Flossenburg, she had managed to map some of the contours of this mystery, outlining questions that future generations of researchers would need to continue exploring with all the seriousness and skepticism that genuine scientific investigation requires. This is just one among the many cases documented by Dr. Kübler Ross that continue to challenge our understanding of the limits of human consciousness and the nature of experience after clinical death. Her investigations invite us to keep alive the courage to ask the most difficult questions, the refusal to accept simplistic answers to complex mysteries, and a deep compassion for all those who go through transformative experiences that challenge our conventional understanding of time, identity, and consciousness. If these questions resonate with your own inquiries into the nature of existence, we invite you to become part of this community of investigators. Subscribe to our channel to follow other rigorous studies that maintain the balance between scientific skepticism and openness to the inexplicable. Share in the comments which city you are watching from, thus building a global network of people connected by the desire to understand the great mysteries of consciousness. Consider sharing this content with someone who seeks understanding about the continuity of consciousness or whose mind is open to exploring territories that conventional science still hesitates to fully investigate. By sharing this knowledge, you are weaving a chain of collective well-being, creating a community where intellectual rigor and spiritual depth walk side by side, strengthening this network of mutual knowledge and personal transformation that expands across continents, languages, and cultures, united by the recognition that the greatest mysteries of human existence deserve our most careful attention, our most rigorous analysis, and our most courageous openness.